Today on Market Journal, we'll tackle the latest cattle on feed report. Our expert breaks down the numbers, talks trade, and more. It's a seminar series that's been bringing grasses to the masses for almost a quarter of a century. See what it's all about and learn how you can get a front row seat. And we don't want to retain water, but your soil is another story. Hear what researchers are doing to get the most from your moisture during the colder months. Plus, stalk rot has been reported across many cornfields. We'll tell you what to look for in your crop and show you some tests that can be done. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and welcome to Market Journal. We're wrapping up September. I know it's a busy time for lots of folks watching, so we appreciate that you're taking the time to spend a little bit of your day with us. We've got lots of really important info to talk about today, so let's jump right in. We're going to sit down with this week's market analyst in a second, but first I want us to take a quick check of the latest cattle on feed report. This report, of course, is released monthly. Cattle and calves on feed for feedlots with a capacity of 1,000 or more head totaled 11.1 million on September 1st. That's up 6% from a year ago. Feedlot placements totaled just over 2 million head, 7% above last year's numbers. Other disappearance, which includes death, moving from feed to pasture, or shipments to other feedlots totaled 55,000. That's 12% above a year ago. Dr. Scott Brown, an ag economist with the University of Missouri Extension, will help us examine those numbers a little more. He's our market analyst this week. We'll get his thoughts on some other things too. Scott, thanks for being here with us.
You bet, Troy. Glad to be here.
All right, so let's start off by getting your take on the latest cattle on feed report. Any surprises for you?
Well, I think the surprise we really got out of last week's report was just the number of placements that we had there, setting at outside of pre-report estimates at over 107% of a year ago. Certainly suggests we got a lot more cattle being placed in August, and maybe more than anybody really thought going in, although once you start looking at that data a little more carefully, a lot of lightweight placements to me suggest that we moved some calves maybe earlier than normal just because of dry weather conditions in some part of cattle country.
Yeah, let's dive in a little more on those numbers. How does it compare with years past?
Yeah, so when you look at September 1 on feed numbers, 11,125,000 head of cattle on feed as of September 1. That is a record for September going back all the way to when this data series began back in 1996. So certainly looking at record numbers, and again, even that cattle on feed inventory coming in at the upper end of pre-report estimates, got a lot of cattle to deal with, and frankly maybe not surprising just given the growth that we've seen in beef cows over the last few years.
And moving on to dairy and producers, they've been having some trouble lately as far as that goes. Catch us up to date on some of the issues that they've been experiencing.
Yeah, when you look at the dairy industry in particular, we've certainly seen a lot of financial stress occurring in the industry in 2018. Lower than maybe we expected milk prices to be when we left 2017 has plagued the industry for much of this year. It's created a situation where we've probably seen some acceleration in the exit of dairy farms out of the United States. And really, I think we've continued to expect to see some changes in terms of slowdown in milk supplies, but it really hasn't happened, keeping us in a very tough financial situation.
Have you been getting lots of questions from dairy producers about maybe what they should do? Any advice on what you tell them?
Yeah, so certainly a lot of producers wondering whether now's the time to exit the business. Some of them, I think, who might have equity left at this point in time are going, is this the time for me to get out, or should I stay in? I guess I look right now and you look at the situation globally. We've got New Zealand that's seen milk supplies expand quite a bit here of late. We have adequate supplies of stocks both here in the United States as well as places like the European Union. And so the supply side is really full, and even here in the United States we continue to see expansion in milk supplies. We looked back at that July expansion being only 0.5%, and we might have thought we were starting to slow down milk supply growth, only to come back with the August numbers being 1.4% higher and another 5,000 dairy cows in the United States. So despite the financial situation, we're actually seeing expansion in places like Texas where we're adding more dairy cows. I just like to remind producers the structure of the dairy industry is changing really quickly today, and you've got to figure out where your spot is in that industry with the rapid consolidation that seems to be unfolding.
All right, let's switch gears, talk about the hog market for a second. And Hurricane Florence caused Smithfield Foods to shut down slaughter operations for almost 2 weeks. And they're the largest pork producer in the U.S., so how big of a disruption was that to the market, and do you think things are getting back on track?
Yeah, so I think you look at what happened, certainly the smaller slaughter runs that we saw as Smithfield was shut down for that period, I think that certainly helped boost hog prices. That and a combination of African swine fever discussion out of China and Europe helped as well. So I think it was positive. I think as we look forward, we now have hogs to deal with, and by and large that's going to be a Smithfield problem to continue to move those hogs that maybe weren't able to be slaughtered in a timely fashion. Probably not that disruptive to the rest of the industry, and I guess as I look at the data that we have early in this week, it seems like we're getting back to much more traditional runs, and so things are getting back online in terms of what we'll see probably for this week in terms of slaughter.
Well, that's good news to hear that at least. Now, I don't know if you've heard, but trade has been in the news, lots of trade news. We're still working things out with Canada when it comes to NAFTA. Who knows what's going to happen with China? What do you think is going to go down with all the trade that's been going on?
Well, Troy, I often say, I'll tell you right after it all happens what did unfold on the trade side, but I guess you're going to make me speculate at this point. I will say that to me, there's a lot of moving pieces to deal with. NAFTA is certainly one of them, where for pork markets in particular, I'll say Mexico is really important to that industry. So if we could get something with Mexico going, we'll see that as helpful. I think it still is a lot of effort to get something with the Canadians done at this point as well, just given some of the tough issues related to the dairy industry. China, to me, is really difficult to figure out at the end of the day. It seems like the longer we stay locked in this trade battle where we're both ramping up new tariffs on products, you know, as the Chinese announced new tariffs on hides for us here in the United States, I worry about some of the effects on livestock markets as a result of what likely will be lower hide prices going forward. At the same time, when you think about something like African swine fever, if that is really devastating to the Chinese pork industry, where we produce and consume half the world's pork, at some point they may be looking for markets that will import pork into China, and I think we set well poised for that, even with tariffs in place. So to me, there's a lot of external factors that likely drive how quickly the Chinese might reduce tariffs on our products.
Dr. Scott Brown, University of Missouri Extension, always appreciate your insight. Great talking with you today.
You bet, Troy.
Next week, we'll be joined by Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners. We'll get his take on the latest crop news. So if you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Moving on, and healthy grasslands are important to the environment, soil and water quality, animals, and even the economy. We checked out one long-running seminar series that aims to remind producers, educators, and environmental enthusiasts of the role they play in enhancing the sustainability of this natural resource. For Dr. Steve Waller, fall is one of his favorite times. It's not the cooler temperatures, the changing leaves, or even that harvest is in full swing. It's because he gets to share in his passion with like-minded individuals and those eager to learn about the complexities of one of Nebraska's most remarkable resources.
I'd like for them to be able to look at a grassland, wherever it be, whether they be driving through the sandhills on Highway 2 or looking at 9 Mile Prairie or any piece of grassland. Think about the richness of the resource itself and really how beautiful it is. It's not always just a front lawn.
So thinking more about aesthetics, thinking about ecotourism, cultural identity.
The University of Nebraska's Center for Grassland Studies holds an annual fall seminar series. This is its 24th year, and Waller has been a part of every single one. The series is free and open to anyone who wants to learn more about grassland management, conservation, ranch profitability, grazing strategies, and more.
Well, it's a very broad audience. We'd love to have people that are actually professionals in the field, as well as those wanting to be professionals. We've got students that are engaged in the seminar, but we'd also like to have just the general public that just want to know a little bit more about the grasslands and how they're managed, and what's a good strategy for grassland use. So it's very, very broad, and you can almost always pick up something, whether you're from Omaha or from Dunning, Nebraska.
Dr. Drac Twidwell has spoken at the series several times and enjoys how it encourages participation among producer groups and looks for ways to solve the problems being faced.
When you're talking about integrative programs like this one and seminars like this one, you're really trying to focus on something that goes beyond individual specializations and specialties, and usually right there between those specializations we can identify, well, here's what we're currently challenged to do in grasslands as a whole. Not just here in Nebraska, but all over the Great Plains and all over the world.
And according to Waller, that opportunity to rub elbows with experts and share research is something attendees might not otherwise get.
They enjoy the opportunity to visit with the speakers, but amongst themselves. And so it's fun to step back and just watch the audience interact. And it's out online as well, so we get a much broader audience than those sitting in the room, which is a change from 24 years ago. But it's fascinating to see how grasslands can touch so many people.
Even though the seminar series has evolved over the course of almost a quarter century, the grasslands themselves remain resilient, a symbol of Nebraska's heritage.
It still is the common thread for our, actually for our economy in the state, as well as the history of our culture and our economics all, I think, derive themselves from grassland history. And so I think when they leave this series, as in any other, I think they'll have a better appreciation for what we're doing, which is actually borrowing this resource from our grandchildren, and we need to be sure we give it to them in better shape than we've inherited it. And so it's a very futuristic view of how science is applied to improve our lives.
The seminar series will be running most Mondays through November 26th. It takes place at the University of Nebraska East Campus, and it can be viewed online too. For a full list of dates and topics, visit grassland.unl.edu, and you can also email the Center for Grassland Studies. That email address is grassland@unl.edu. We're barely into fall, but it's never too early to be thinking about colder weather and how to best prepare your fields. We spoke to Steve Melvin with UNL Extension about some things you can do to get ready when it comes to cover crops and irrigated fields.
Yeah, cover crops is an interesting thing. We usually think about the water use from those being a cost. You know, we just know it costs water to grow crops. But when we get to our irrigated ground, and that's what kind of our focus is here today, is on irrigated land, that many times we leave the fields fairly wet in the fall, and it's just hard to get them the level that we should. You know, right now is about the right time to start using the university recommendations to start drying the fields down and leave them fairly dry in the fall. In fact, there's a neb guide that can be downloaded offline, and you know, take a look at a procedure to calculate that. And if we get them dried down to a level where we can store some water over the winter, is what we're trying to do, and obviously not pump water, and then we get a free refill over the winter, if you will. But typically what I've seen, and using quite a bit of data to back this up, that most farmers leave the field about at field capacity with maybe as much as 2 or 3 inches of storage is about all. It's just hard to get the soil dried down. We need to keep them fairly wet so we've got a good irrigated crop. Even though we can dry them down pretty good in the fall, it's just a lot of guys don't get it done. So we get, you know, in central part of Nebraska, about 14 inches of moisture off season over the winter and into the early spring. And if we've only got, 2 or 3 inches of storage room, we're going to have quite a bit of that water deep percolate and or run off. And so with the cover crops on irrigated ground, really that water that's being used by the cover crop a lot of times is just water that would have deep percolated anyway. And so there really isn't a cost to it. It's not like we need to start the pivot and pump on a bunch of water in the spring because of cover crops. But we need to have a plan. If it's a dry winter, dry spring, we really need to keep an eye on that, and maybe we decide to terminate the cover crop a little bit early. If it's a wet spring, maybe we even go the other extreme and plant into a growing cover crop, because that's, having ET off of that crop, getting it so we can get back in the field a little bit quicker. So really the plan needs to be adaptive, so if it's a wet year or dry year, we can make changes accordingly. So yeah, if you end up planting a cover crop and killing it early because it's dry, we got what we got. I mean, it's that much more than we would have had with a cover crop if we hadn't have planted anything into it. So if we end up killing it off early because it's dry, and particularly on the non-irrigated, we want to be really careful there that we don't use water that then is going to reduce our main cash crop during the summer. And so, you just do what nature allows you to do. If it's a dry year, you got to be careful not use the water. Well, certainly Extension has a lot of research projects going on with that, and there's, most any of the Extension offices would have some of that information. There's other specialists. You can look up Crop Watch newsletter that we talk about on this program quite often, has a lot of articles related to that. And so there's just a lot of places to get information.
Besides reducing water runoff, like Steve mentioned, cover crops will also provide long-term soil health. And when we're talking about soil health, one thing you don't want to hear is the word rot, especially as it relates to cornfields. I sat down with University of Nebraska plant pathologist Dr. Tamra Jackson-Ziems to discuss corn stalk rot. So what is it exactly, and what can you do if it's happened to you?
The biggest problem right now that I'm concerned about in some of our cornfields as we're winding down the season and getting ready for harvest is that we do have a high incidence of stalk rot disease out there now. And in some fields, I think this is going to be a very serious problem. And of course, what we mean by that is the loss of stalk integrity on the inside. We have a lot of fungi that infect the stalk, and this can happen throughout the season, and especially in those fields that may have been under stress earlier, which in Nebraska in 2018 was most of our fields, from either too much water, too little water, leaf diseases, or whatever. And so those plants are ones that will have cannibalized the stalk, basically hollowing it out, but it makes it weaker this time of year. And as we approach harvest, if we have high winds, we could definitely have some lodging, causing our producers some complications during harvest.
So any main parts of the state that this is impacting?
There's some a little bit everywhere. And so if I was a producer, what I would do is to go out and be sure and scout those fields that are at higher risk for things like that, or where you might have seen these types of problems before. Even from the outside of the field, you can see some early evidence, and perhaps some of the corn died earlier than the rest of the field or turned an off color very quickly. That can be early evidence of stalk rot disease.
And you've mentioned that, I was reading an article and you said that some of the symptoms of stalk rot can be misleading and make it difficult to diagnose. What are some specific things to look for?
Initially, they may notice some of the leaves turning color early, and even if adequate moisture is available, some of those plants will dry up quickly within days. And that may indicate that below ground you've got some root rot and lower stalk rot that you can't see until you dig those plants up and cut them open lengthwise with your knife. And then you can see down in that soil line and crown line where some of that evidence is of discoloration and rot. And it can happen anywhere along the stem and stalk. And you may even see a concentration of that at each of the nodes too. And it shuts off water movement up the plant, and that's what causes that rapid loss.
And there's also like a push and a pinch method too that kind of helps with diagnosing it too. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. That's probably the easiest way for a producer to really get an idea if they have a problem and what the likelihood is that this crop is going to stand until harvest. And so the easiest way is to do the push test. And so walking through a large part of the field, pushing on at least, I would say at least 100 different plants. And so we recommend just pushing it at arm's length to about a 30-degree angle from upright, letting that plant snap back upright or not. And if it bends over below the ear, and I would keep track of the number of those that bend over and calculate your percentage. And if you have more than about 10% of those plants bending over, then you're at higher risk for stalk rot, especially the closer we get to harvest, because it'll only get worse from here. And it might be worth harvesting the worst fields first, even at the expense of having to dry the grain a little bit. Many people will remember last year's high winds that we experienced in October. We lost a lot of corn last year, both ear droppage and stalk rot. We'd like to avoid that this year.
Anything else a farmer can do if they think they've been affected?
There's nothing else this year, unfortunately, except adjusting that harvest order. But the thing I would keep in mind is which fields you might be seeing this problem in year after year, and in particular, now it's a good idea to identify which stalk rot diseases are affecting you. Because in the past, a decade ago, we didn't have resistant varieties or hybrids for many of these diseases, but we do now. Many of our contemporary hybrids are more resistant, and if there are fields that you like to harvest a little later, or maybe they're further away from your home place, and you tend to put them toward the end, they need to stand longer and better. And so especially those, I would consider putting resistant hybrids in to avoid this.
Okay, so if a farmer has been infected with the stalk rot or the ear rot, anything else they can do in advance of planting for next season so they can just get rid of this problem, or do what they can to get rid of the problem?
I think in general we do everything we can already to minimize stress on the crop. And stress any time during the season, whether that is due to water or nutrient loss or anything, is something that can lead to stalk rot later on. And so we're doing most of that already, and so that one additional thing is selecting the hybrid. That can definitely help. Ear rot diseases are a little bit different scenario. Those are, and all of these things, we're all victims of the circumstances we have during the season and trying to combat that. Ear rot diseases are something else I'm worried about this season.
And yeah, you mentioned the ear rot and the stalk rot. Any other diseases we should look out for?
Those two right now would probably be our biggest concern this year as we wind down. And as we go into winter time, hybrid selection is probably one of the best and easiest and least expensive ways to manage diseases. And so if you're having more gray leaf spot or any other disease, I would certainly keep track of which fields are affected by those diseases and position resistant hybrids out there accordingly.
If you've got a crop that has a disease and you'd like for someone to take a second look at it, contact the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic at UNL. As a legume, soybeans meet most of their nitrogen demand through a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Although a smaller percentage of nitrogen has to come from the soil supply, it'll take 4 pounds of nitrogen for each bushel of soybeans produced. Now a number of soybean growers in western Nebraska have applied late-season nitrogen to help meet this additional demand. Strahinja Stepanovich is an extension educator in western Nebraska, and for the last couple years he's tested late-season nitrogen applications on soybeans. Read about his research and results from the first year in the September Nebraska Farmer. It's time now for weather with Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, we're closing out the month with a little bit of a chill in the air, but what's that first week of October going to bring us?
Well, Troy, you are correct. We had some cool weather. In fact, we had some hard freeze conditions around the Alliance area. Temperatures got down to officially in the 25 to 24 degree range. Light scattered frost reported across the Panhandle with some temperatures getting down into the 32 to 30 degree range. Then we had some scattered frost that was picked up as we seen the cold front come through last night, and we've seen some reports this morning up in northeast Nebraska of some scattered frost, but nothing widespread. In terms of as we go forward in time, it looks like we have several opportunities once again for some moisture to move into our area. And as we go to the upper air models, what we will draw your attention to is another push of cold air. The first of it came through yesterday, and we're going to see another push of cold air with this trough that's moving over the Great Lakes region. We do have surface low basically in eastern Colorado, northeastern Colorado. The moisture advection with this system is fairly weak. Most of the activity is going to be along the Gulf Coast, is being intercepted by a wave, so we're not going to get the moisture advection. And then as we go into tomorrow, we see some bubbling up of the ridge, but we'll see another push of cold air as we go into Monday. But so we'll see some fairly decent conditions. Although their surface lows again are depicted in the Dakotas, most of the moisture is way up to our north and our northeast. And as we get into the day on Monday, now we get the secondary push of cold air as another front tries to push its way through. We'll see surface lows lining up along the front range of the Rocky Mountains. This should help to lift a little bit of moisture up in toward our region. It looks like precipitation from eastern Nebraska up into the Great Lakes, with a tropical moisture feed starting to set up in the southwest. So as we get in the day on Tuesday, that tropical moisture feed from the system that's in the Baja Peninsula will feed this low pressure system that's going to develop over western Kansas, and that should juice the atmosphere up. So we'll start to see some heavier rain developing in northern Iowa, and some very heavy moisture in the southwest. And as we get in the day on Wednesday, we see a separation of the flows. This low is cut off from the cold air to the north, but we still see low pressures at the surface lined up both in the Texas Panhandle and in Missouri. And this will derive some very heavy precipitation, unfortunately, over a good portion of Iowa and points to the east, with some of that moving into eastern Nebraska. And then as we get in the day Thursday, we see another trough. Looks like it's going to start bringing some cool air in as we go into next weekend, with low pressure up in North Dakota and to the south of us. That's going to tap that moisture feed, and it looks like some of that precipitation will make it up into western Nebraska before we start to see the entire cold front push through the region Thursday night and Friday, bringing much cooler air into our region, and the possibility once again for some freezing conditions in the high plains region. Precipitation, we see most of the precipitation directed toward Kansas and up toward the northeast, with a mixture of rain and snow up into the Great Lakes. And it looks like if we're going to see precipitation of any consequence, the area most likely under the gun will be east central and southeastern Nebraska. As we look even farther out in time, that warm air continues to be pushed toward our southeast. That cold air kind of sets up to our north, so that's going to be the mean frontal boundary. So it looks like we're going to be caught right between the cool air to the north and the warm air to the south. And in terms of precipitation, several more waves of precipitation are expected to move out of the southwest, with that moisture feed intersecting the front, giving us heavy precipitation, particularly Iowa and points to the eastward. So Troy, it looks like we're going to see some fall-like conditions, with probably a chance for precipitation on Monday and toward the end of the week.
Thanks so much, Al. All of today's stories are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. And you can keep up to date with the latest in ag news by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's going to do it for this week. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.